He would continue walking through our world, not as a ruler, but as a witness, seeing the confusion of a generation that knows everything, yet understands nothing. He'd notice how we fill every silence with noise, because silence forces us to face ourselves. And he would wonder how a species that conquered flight and fire could still be terrified of its own thoughts. He'd walk through schools where children are taught to chase grades instead of wisdom, through offices where adults chase promotions instead of purpose, through homes where people sleep beside partners but feel more connected to strangers online. And he'd write again in that calm voice that has survived millennia. You do not suffer from the world, but from your judgment of it. He'd watch us try to escape our emotions through screens and wonder why we never learned to sit with them. Marcus would not run from sadness. He would greet it like an old friend, for he knew that sorrow is the price of a conscious mind. He'd see our obsession with positivity and laugh gently, because he'd understand that the goal is not constant happiness, but unwavering strength. He'd say, stop chasing a life without pain. Build a mind that remains steady within it. In 2025, he'd observe how people worship productivity while forgetting purpose, how we fill our calendars yet empty our souls. He'd see people trying to hack their minds while avoiding the truth that mastery requires endurance, not shortcuts. To him, every moment of frustration, every delay, every rejection would be sacred material, raw clay from which character is molded. He'd remind us that discipline isn't about controlling the world, but about controlling how we meet it. He'd see our generation's anxiety, the feeling of always being behind, the constant need to prove something, and whisper, you can never be behind in a race that has no finish line. He'd teach us to slow down, not out of laziness, but out of clarity, because when you slow down, you start to see what truly matters and what never did. He'd walk through a crowd of people chasing luxury cars, designer clothes, and digital clout, and he'd see the same hunger he saw in Rome, the hunger to be seen, admired, remembered. And yet he'd remind us that the universe itself forgets emperors, and that the only lasting monument is virtue. He'd say, the moment you stop needing to be remembered, you start to truly live. Marcus would be the kind of man who eats quietly, walks slowly, and thinks deeply in a world obsessed with speed. His stillness would make people uncomfortable, because stillness exposes everything we try to avoid. He'd show us that our endless need for entertainment isn't freedom, it's slavery disguised as choice. And he'd tell us that the highest pleasure is peace. He'd view social media not as evil, but as a test, a reflection of whether you can engage without being consumed. To Marcus, every post, every reaction, every emotion would be an opportunity to practice detachment. If he saw hatred online, he'd see it as proof of ignorance, not as an excuse for retaliation. If he saw envy, he'd use it to reflect on his own desires. He'd show that wisdom is not withdrawal, but awareness, the ability to walk through fire and remain unburned. He'd observe how modern humans idolize opinions more than understanding. In debates that lead to nowhere, he'd see a tragic comedy, thousands of voices fighting to be right, while none seek to be wise. And he'd ask us, what do you gain by winning arguments, but losing peace? To him, the ego would be the new plague, invisible yet deadly, spreading through every scroll, every post, every emotion. He'd remind us that humility is not weakness, but armor, that silence often says more than speech. He'd see us worship celebrities as if they were gods, and pity us, not because we love them, but because we've forgotten how to love ourselves without comparison. And in his quiet way, he'd teach again that the only person you must impress is the one reflected in your mind before you sleep. He would walk at dawn, watching cities wake to chaos, horns, headlines, urgency, and whisper to the morning air another chance to remain unbroken. For Marcus, every sunrise was a reminder that he'd been given one more day to be virtuous, not successful. And that's what would confuse most people in 2025, that he cared more about integrity than image, more about peace than pleasure, more about principle than popularity. He'd refuse to trade his calm for anything, because to him, calmness was not passivity, but power, the kind that cannot be bought, only earned. If Marcus lived today, he wouldn't run from modernity. He'd adapt without losing essence. He'd use technology wisely, like a stoic warrior wielding a blade, sharp, disciplined, and only when necessary. He'd remind you that your phone isn't the enemy, your dependence is. He'd teach that your thoughts, not your tools, shape your destiny. He'd turn the same devices that make most people weaker into instruments of strength by filling them with wisdom instead of noise, education instead of distraction, purpose instead of vanity. And as the world keeps screaming for your attention, Marcus would smile and say, "You owe the world your virtue, not your reaction." He'd go to sleep not worried about likes or followers, but about whether he lived with reason, justice, courage, and moderation, the four stoic virtues that never go out of style. He'd see every insult, delay, failure, and temptation as a classroom, and that's the lesson he'd leave behind, that life never stops testing you, and your peace depends not on the questions, but on how calmly you answer them. He'd remind you that every distraction you overcome is a small victory, every emotion you master a quiet revolution, every day you live deliberately a declaration of freedom. And when people would ask him, "Marcus, how do I find peace in this chaotic world?" he'd look at them, calm and steady, and say, "You don't find peace, you create it. Because peace is not out there, hiding behind wealth, success, or love. It's within, waiting for discipline to uncover it." He'd leave us with one final truth, that everything around us, every trend, every headline, every storm will pass, but who you become in the process will remain. And maybe that's the message we need most in 2025, that your greatest empire is not the one you build online, but the one you rule within, your mind. So the next time you wake up and feel lost, anxious, or trapped by the noise of the world, remember what Marcus would do. He'd breathe, reflect, and whisper to himself, "This too is part of the training." Because to Marcus, life was never meant to be easy. It was meant to make you strong. And in that realization, you might finally understand that Marcus Aurelius wouldn't just survive in our time, he'd thrive. Not because the world became simpler, but because he never stopped practicing the hardest art of all, the art of mastering himself.
If Marcus Aurelius walked into the world of 2025, he wouldn't be impressed by the skyscrapers, the speed of Wi-Fi, or the illusion of progress we call convenience. He would be concerned by how quietly men and women have surrendered their freedom to invisible masters, their phones, their desires, their fears, their cravings for validation. He'd stand in the middle of a crowded street, neon lights flickering, cars honking, advertisements screaming for attention, and he'd see what we fail to notice every day, a civilization that has conquered everything except itself. If he could speak, his first words wouldn't be poetic or grand, they'd be piercing. You've built empires out of pixels and lost empires within yourselves. That's the question he would pose to you, to me, to everyone. Are you the master of your mind or just a puppet dancing to the rhythm of your impulses? You can click away now, move to another distraction, scroll to something easier. But if you do, you'll miss what this world hides behind its noise. The truth that Marcus Aurelius understood 2,000 years ago. Everything external is unstable, but the mind that governs itself is unshakable. He would live among us, not above us. He wouldn't sit on a throne because in 2025, the new throne is attention, and he would treat it like sacred ground. He would wake up not to chase dopamine, but to face himself. The moment his eyes opened, he wouldn't reach for a phone, he'd reach for stillness. He'd breathe, look inward, and ask himself the same questions he once wrote in his meditations. What am I here for? What do I control? What am I allowing to control me? And as the world outside burned in constant stimulation, Marcus would choose silence, not because it's fashionable, but because silence is where the soul sharpens itself. He'd write, as he always did, not for others, but for himself. In 2025, his notebook might glow with blue light, but the thoughts would remain the same. Today, I will meet people distracted, addicted, and anxious. They will talk more than they act, scroll more than they live, chase pleasure more than purpose. And yet I will not let them change me. For the power to remain myself in the face of madness is the only empire worth ruling. That's how his day would begin, not with notifications, but with awareness, not with consumption, but with creation. And while we spend hours trying to appear disciplined, he would quietly be disciplined. He would walk among us and see everyone moving fast, yet going nowhere. He would see gyms full of people building bodies, but neglecting their minds. Online forums full of advice, but empty of action. Lives overflowing with information, but starved of wisdom. And he would remind us of what he wrote centuries ago, that it is not the external storm that disturbs you, but your inability to remain still within it. In 2025, the storm has become louder, but the principle remains the same. He would live by one rule: master the moment or be mastered by it. Every notification would be a test, every advertisement a temptation, every idle minute an opportunity to practice the art of restraint. Marcus wouldn't delete social media, he'd simply use it without being used by it. He'd understand that technology, like fire, can cook your food or burn your house down, depending on who's in control. He'd use it to learn, to communicate virtue, to spread wisdom, but never to escape himself. And while the modern world preaches self-expression, he would preach self-possession, because he would see what most of us ignore. When you give your attention freely, you give your life away in fragments. You are robbed not by thieves, but by your own habits. And so, Marcus would guard his attention like a soldier guards the gates of a city under siege. He'd treat every minute as sacred, every distraction as a threat, every decision as a reflection of his character. He would understand that luxury is not abundance, but control, the ability to say no when everything screams yes. He'd eat simply, speak rarely, and act decisively. He wouldn't post quotes about stoicism. He'd live them until people noticed. He wouldn't preach detachment. He'd embody it until detachment became his aura. In an age obsessed with external validation, he would find joy in invisibility, in doing good quietly, thinking deeply, and walking alone without feeling lonely. He'd look at the influencers chasing attention and feel no envy, because he would know that what they gain in views, they lose in peace. And to him, peace would remain the highest currency. He'd look at the self-help industry and smile, not with arrogance, but with sadness, because he'd realize that most people don't want truth. They want comfort dressed as wisdom. He'd remind us that no hack, no system, no routine will save you if you still refuse to master your emotions. He'd tell us to stop outsourcing meaning and start building it brick by brick within our souls. Marcus Aurelius would walk into a modern apartment, see a man slouched on a couch, scrolling endlessly through clips of people doing what he dreams of doing, and he'd say, "You are dying, not because life is short, but because you waste it." He wouldn't lecture about virtue. He'd demonstrate it by living deliberately. Every action would be an act of philosophy, every decision a declaration of who he chooses to be. He'd remind us that life's greatest war is fought in silence, between the part of you that wants comfort and the part that seeks greatness. And in that war, every act of discipline is a victory. He'd walk into boardrooms, classrooms, and cafes filled with restless minds and ask, "What would you do if you stopped fearing discomfort?" Because that, to him, was the essence of Stoicism, not the absence of pain, but the mastery of response. In 2025, Marcus Aurelius would not retreat to mountains or monasteries. He would live among the chaos to prove that peace is not found by escaping the world, but by conquering yourself within it. He'd face anxiety with awareness, not avoidance. He'd face uncertainty with purpose, not panic. He'd look at the endless race for success and ask, success for what? He'd see people obsessed with goals, but ignorant of virtue, driven but directionless, and he'd whisper to them the same truth he once wrote for himself. A man's worth is measured by the things he lets go of. He'd remind us that your peace is not a gift, but a discipline, a practice forged through choices that no one applauds. He'd find beauty in moderation, power in restraint, and freedom in simplicity. He'd live below his means, not to appear humble, but to prove that contentment isn't poverty, it's strength. And when the world mocked him for not chasing the next big thing, he'd smile, because he'd already found the biggest thing, mastery over his mind. He'd see people addicted to opinions, debates, and validation, and he'd say, "You've mistaken noise for knowledge." He'd teach that wisdom begins where argument ends. In his eyes, every complaint would be weakness in disguise, every victim mentality a refusal to take ownership. He'd live with such calmness that even his presence would feel like a challenge, because you'd see what it looks like when a human being is no longer owned by fear, craving, or comparison. And maybe that's why this video matters, because if Marcus Aurelius were alive today, he wouldn't tell you how to live. He'd show you. He'd show you that real power isn't ruling nations or commanding armies. It's waking up and conquering your own chaos. He'd show you that the richest man is the one who needs the least, that progress isn't moving faster, but moving with purpose, that the most rebellious act in the modern world is to remain calm, grounded, and moral when everyone else is lost in noise. He'd walk through this century like a mirror, showing us who we've become, overfed yet starved, connected yet isolated, informed yet ignorant, busy yet empty. And yet he wouldn't despair, because Marcus never believed humanity was beyond redemption. He'd say, the world changes, but the soul's work remains the same. He'd see in us the same struggle he faced, the battle.
Marcus Aurelius would live like the world could fall apart tomorrow, and he would still remain whole. He would walk through the noise of 2025 as if each sound were a test, each distraction a temptation, and each moment a teacher. He would see how everyone speaks of purpose, yet few ever sit quietly long enough to find it. He would know that we drown ourselves in the pursuit of things that glitter but do not glow. The emperor-philosopher would observe the modern obsession with appearing wise rather than becoming wise, and he would shake his head gently, understanding that true wisdom is silent, humble, and earned in solitude. He'd remind us that reading quotes from Meditations is not stoicism, living them is. He'd say that peace isn't found in pages or podcasts, but in your ability to remain calm when chaos unfolds before you. In 2025, Marcus would likely live in a small apartment, filled not with luxury, but with order. A table, a notebook, a few well-used books, perhaps a cup of tea by the window. He'd see the beauty in simplicity because he would know that peace cannot exist where excess does. He'd wake early, not to post a productivity hack, but to watch the sunrise and whisper to himself, "You've been given one more day. Don't waste it." He'd walk to work or take the train, watching faces absorbed by glowing screens, people scrolling for meaning, unaware they're trading life for distraction. He'd think, you have the wisdom of centuries in your pocket, yet you use it to compare your lives to strangers. He wouldn't condemn technology, he'd master it. To him, the tool was never the problem, only the user. He'd use AI not to escape thought, but to sharpen it, not to replace discipline, but to amplify it. He'd remind us that no invention can make us virtuous, that technology cannot cure the soul. It can connect minds, but not hearts. It can create comfort, but not character. He'd teach that the next great evolution of humanity is not digital, but moral. He would see influencers building empires of vanity and say softly, "You have built a kingdom of mirrors, but who will you be when the reflection fades?" He'd remind us that fame is a fog. It looks solid until you try to hold it. He'd see how people confuse visibility with value and success with virtue. For Marcus, success would not mean being known. It would mean being worthy of knowing. He would not measure his life in numbers or applause, but in how often he acted with wisdom when it was hardest to. He would teach that if your peace can be taken away by an opinion, it was never peace. It was ego disguised as confidence.
When the world raged with political division, moral decay, and economic struggle, Marcus would not panic. He would return to principle. "The world has always been on fire," he'd say. "Your duty is not to stop the flame, but to remain unburned." He would refuse to be consumed by outrage, because he would understand that anger clouds judgment, and judgment is the tool of the wise. He'd advocate for balance, neither detached nor fanatical, because true stoicism is not indifference, but disciplined compassion. He would act where action is needed and accept what cannot be changed, knowing that serenity is the sharpest weapon against chaos. He would not isolate himself from society, for Marcus believed life was meant to be lived among people, not apart from them. But he would draw invisible lines, boundaries made of reason and patience. He'd talk to people with empathy, but never let their noise dictate his tone. He'd listen to arguments, not to respond, but to understand. He'd teach that listening is the rarest form of strength in a world that only wants to speak. And when others attack him for his calm, calling it weakness, he'd smile, because he would know that nothing threatens the chaotic more than the composed. At night, when the world slips into digital dreams, Marcus would sit by candlelight, or maybe the soft glow of a desk lamp, and write, not for fame, not for publication, but for clarity. His writings would still be called meditations, but they'd be written in notes on his phone, unseen by the world. He'd write about patience when frustrated, about forgiveness when wronged, about death when grateful. His journal would be a mirror, reflecting his mind, sharpening his soul. And he'd urge us to do the same. Write not to impress others, but to understand yourself. He'd remind us that pain is not your enemy, but your greatest instructor. When life disappoints you, he'd say, "Good, now you can practice endurance." When people betray you, he'd say, "Good, now you can practice forgiveness." When you fail, he'd say, "Good, now you can practice humility." Every hardship would be an invitation to virtue. Marcus would believe that every emotion, anger, fear, envy, is raw material for mastery. You don't suppress them, you sculpt them. He'd say, "You cannot control what the world gives you, but you can always control the meaning you attach to it." That would be his freedom, the inner empire that no power could invade. He'd remind us that self-control is the ultimate luxury in a world that preaches indulgence, that fasting from anger, ego, and impulsive desires builds more strength than any gym could. He'd live simply, not because he despises pleasure, but because he refuses to be its slave. His joy would come from mastery, not excess. He'd sip coffee slowly, walk deliberately, speak sparingly. Every act would be intentional, like a prayer. And that quiet discipline would be his rebellion against the noise of modern life. In his friendships, he'd seek honesty over comfort. He wouldn't surround himself with admirers, but with challengers, people who push him to think deeper and live truer. He'd say, "The friend who flatters you steals your growth." He'd teach that solitude isn't loneliness, but strength in disguise. For him, silence would not be empty, it would be full of answers. He'd value time as the most sacred possession, spending it only on that nourishes his soul. He'd remind us that wasting time is worse than wasting money, because time cannot be earned back. He'd walk among the poor, the lost, the broken, not with pity, but with presence. He'd know that suffering is universal and virtue is the only true wealth. He'd help quietly, without recognition, because he'd understand that the best deeds are the ones the world never sees. He'd serve not for reward, but because it's the right thing to do. He'd remind us that compassion isn't weakness, it's strength refined by wisdom. And when the world speaks of the future, of space travel, artificial intelligence, transhumanism, Marcus would smile, because he'd know that no matter how far humanity goes, it will always be haunted by the same questions. Who am I? What is right? How should I live? He'd remind us that progress without virtue is regression disguised, that we can conquer galaxies but still lose ourselves if we don't master the mind. He'd say, you can build machines that think faster, but can you build humans that think clearer? He'd live as proof that peace isn't an achievement, but a practice, that calmness is a skill anyone can learn through discipline. And though he lived 2 millennia ago, his way would feel more revolutionary than any modern philosophy. Because in a time when everyone screams to be heard, he'd show that silence can still move the world. He'd show that real change doesn't come from shouting at others, but mastering oneself. He'd show that the greatest revolution begins within. If you passed him on a busy street, you might not even notice him. He wouldn't wear his wisdom, he'd embody it. But if you looked closer, into his calm eyes, his gentle posture, his unhurried pace, you'd feel something unsettling and inspiring all at once. You'd sense a man who has nothing to prove.
And he'd see clearly that the sickness is not of the body, but of the spirit, a fatigue born from disconnection, from living too far from the present moment. He'd say, you are drowning in abundance, yet starving for meaning. He'd see how modern people are surrounded by comfort, but plagued by emptiness, how the noise of the world never lets them hear the whisper of their own souls. And he would not mock this suffering. He'd meet it with compassion, for he too had lived through plagues, wars, and loss. He'd teach that suffering is not new, only our avoidance of it is. He'd tell us that the cure for despair is not distraction, but direction. Do not flee from pain, he'd write, use it, shape it into strength. He'd remind the broken that wounds, when faced with courage, become wisdom. He'd teach the anxious that anxiety is not a curse, but a signal, a reminder that your attention has wandered away from the present moment. He'd teach them to breathe deeply, to focus on what is here and now, and to ask with every breath, is this within my control? If not, release it. If yes, face it. And he'd show that peace is not the absence of problems, but the mastery of focus. He'd see how people build identities out of trauma, out of opinions, out of what they oppose. And he'd warn that when you define yourself by conflict, you become the conflict. He'd write, if you wish to live in peace, you must stop fighting to be right. He'd teach that humility is not weakness, but strength of mind, the ability to stand unshaken even when proven wrong. He'd urge us to question more but argue less, to seek truth rather than victory. He'd know that the modern age values argument over understanding, reaction over reflection, and he'd respond not with speeches but with example. Calm amidst provocation, reason amidst rage. He'd show that silence is not surrender, but sovereignty over impulse. He'd walk through protests, debates, digital wars, and he'd say, "You wish to change the world, yet you cannot govern your own anger." He'd remind us that the first revolution must always be internal. He'd say, "You cannot free society while enslaved by emotion." For him, virtue would not mean standing above others, but standing firm within oneself. He'd teach that courage is not shouting in the crowd, but standing alone with integrity. He'd remind us that history's greatest changes were not made by noise, but by quiet conviction, by people who lived differently when it mattered most. He'd notice the modern fear of solitude, how people flee their own company as if it were punishment. He'd write, "If you cannot sit alone with your thoughts, you are not free." For Marcus, solitude would be the gym of the soul, where the mind lifts the weight of silence and grows strong. He'd spend hours journaling, not to produce content, but to confront himself. He'd face his flaws, his pride, his anger, and each time emerge a little lighter, a little wiser. He'd remind us that reflection is the rarest form of courage, to look inward without denial, to meet your shadow and still choose the light. And he'd say that true confidence is born not from what others think of you, but from knowing you've faced your truth and survived. He'd also look at modern relationships, fragile, fleeting, often built on convenience rather than commitment. And he'd write, "Love is not a feeling you chase, but a discipline you practice." He'd teach that real love is an act of reason guided by virtue, loyalty, patience, honesty, forgiveness. He'd see how people abandon one another the moment discomfort appears, and he'd remind us that endurance is the foundation of connection. He'd tell lovers that passion without respect burns quickly, but respect without passion burns forever. He'd remind us that the purpose of love is not pleasure, but growth, to see in another what you cannot see in yourself. And when facing betrayal, he would not grow bitter. He'd simply say, "They acted according to their understanding, I will act according to mine." He'd let go without hatred, for he'd know that resentment binds you tighter to the very person you wish to escape. He'd teach that forgiveness is not approval, but liberation. To forgive is to reclaim your peace. And in an age that glorifies vengeance, he'd show that mercy is the true mark of strength. He'd walk among people obsessed with image, photos, aesthetics, reputations, and he'd ask, what value is there in looking perfect if your mind is in disarray? He'd see how much effort we put into polishing what is seen, while neglecting what is felt. He'd remind us that virtue has no filter, no highlight reel, no performance. He'd write, "Be good, not for the sake of appearing good, but because it is the only way to live free." He'd remind us that self-respect must come before public respect, because without it, every compliment feels hollow, and every insult feels fatal. He'd see how people constantly compare lifestyles, achievements, appearances, and he'd write, "Comparison is the enemy of gratitude." He'd teach that peace begins the moment you stop measuring your life against others and start mastering your own. He'd show that envy is ignorance of your own blessings, and that the most content man is not the one who has more, but the one who needs less. He'd teach us to count inner victories, patience over anger, humility over pride, presence over distraction, and to celebrate them silently. Because those who master themselves no longer crave recognition. He'd live through moments of despair too, because even philosophers bleed. He'd have days where his thoughts are heavy, where the world feels too loud, where even wisdom feels small. But he'd not run from it. He'd observe it, accept it, and let it pass like weather. He'd remind himself, the storm cannot touch what is calm within. He'd know that peace is not a permanent state, but a skill, one that must be practiced every single day. He'd fall, rise, and repeat, not because he sought perfection, but because he understood persistence. And perhaps one evening he'd walk through a crowded city street under neon lights and think, the faces have changed, the tools have changed, but the heart of man remains the same. The same fears, the same desires, the same questions echo through centuries. He'd smile, because he'd know that Stoicism was never about the past. It was about timeless truth. And he'd whisper to those who still seek meaning, do not wait for wisdom to arrive. Live it now. The world will always be chaotic, but your mind does not have to be. Then he'd fade quietly into the crowd, leaving behind no empire, no monument, just words carved into hearts, proof that even in 2025, one steady soul can still change the world.
Because it's his to live rightly. In 2025, Marcus Aurelius would not see himself as a man out of time, but as a reminder that time itself changes nothing about human nature. The same battles he once faced, pride, fear, desire, anger, still live in every mind today, just wearing different masks. The only difference is that we've built bigger stages for our weaknesses. We've given vanity followers, given distraction algorithms, given greed infinite markets. But the war within, the fight for the soul's sovereignty, remains the same. And Marcus would fight it quietly, daily, like a warrior of the unseen. He'd see that in this modern world, it's not swords that conquer men, but screens, not enemies that enslave them, but impulses. And he'd remind us that discipline is still the only armor that doesn't rust. He would live in rhythm with nature even in a digital age. He'd walk barefoot on grass when everyone else scrolls indoors. He'd feel the wind, watch the clouds, listen to the rain, not to escape civilization, but to remember what's real. For him, nature wouldn't just mean forests or rivers, it would mean aligning with the order of things, to live in harmony with what happens instead of wishing it were different. He'd wake with the sun and rest with peace, unbothered by the urgency that consumes the modern soul. His routine would not be aesthetic, it would be sacred. The world would call it minimalism. Marcus would call it sanity. He would see people drowning in opinions, lost in constant judgment of others, and he'd quietly say, "You have forgotten to rule yourself." For to him, self-governance was the foundation of all peace. He'd look at comment wars, gossip, tribal outrage, and see them for what they are, the modern forms of gladiator arenas. He would refuse to fight meaningless battles. His words would not be weapons, they would be medicine. And he'd remind us that silence is not weakness, but restraint.
the highest form of control. He'd likely meditate each morning, before sunrise, his phone off, the city asleep. His breath steady, his mind clear. He'd ask himself what he can control today, what he must accept, and who he must be, regardless of outcome. That simple reflection, forgotten by most, would be his compass in a world spinning off its axis. He'd carry that stillness through his day, letting insults dissolve, letting stress pass through him like wind through open hands. He'd know that peace is not found by avoiding life's storms, but by learning to walk through them without being moved. When people chase dopamine and call it happiness, Marcus would smile sadly. He'd see pleasure not as evil, but fragile, a visitor, not a home. He'd remind us that happiness without discipline decays into craving, that joy to endure must come from meaning, not indulgence. He'd say, "You were not born to feel good, you were born to do good," and that doing, when guided by reason, would bring the deepest fulfillment, the kind no entertainment can imitate. He'd live in joy, not excitement, in clarity, not chaos, in intention, not impulse. He'd see how the young chase validation and the old chase youth, and he'd shake his head, understanding that all are running from the same truth: impermanence. He'd say, "What you fear losing was never yours. Only your choices belong to you." He'd teach that mortality isn't something to dread, but to cherish, that every second slipping away is an invitation to live more rightly. He'd keep a memento mori, maybe not a skull on his desk, but a reminder on his phone screen. You will die. Let that make you kinder. To Marcus, death wouldn't be an end, but a mirror that reflects the urgency to live with virtue now. He'd live modestly, not out of guilt, but freedom. He'd wear the same clothes without care, drive an old car, maybe even take the bus. And he'd smile at those obsessed with appearances, knowing that true elegance lies in restraint. When others boast about their possessions, he'd respond with gratitude for necessities. He'd say, "The less you need, the less the world can control you." His wealth would be measured not in what he owns, but in what he can let go of without suffering. He'd see how relationships have become transactions, how love has become a performance, and he'd live differently. To him, love would be duty, not drama. He'd love quietly, deeply, through presence and understanding, not through spectacle. He'd remind us that loyalty is the purest form of love, not passion that burns bright, but the steady flame that never flickers. He'd say, if you love someone, help them become free. And he'd know that true companionship is not two people needing each other, but two souls walking side by side, whole and disciplined. He'd spend time teaching the young, not through lectures, but through example. He'd tell them that confidence is not noise, but inner steadiness, that greatness begins the moment you stop seeking it. He'd tell them to stop asking, "What should I do with my life?" and instead ask, "How should I live this moment?" For to Marcus, the grand design of life is built from the small acts done rightly. Every choice is a brushstroke on the canvas of character. And he'd remind them that no one can escape self-judgment, that the soul always knows when you have betrayed your better self. He'd also find humor in modern chaos. He'd laugh, quietly, sincerely, at the absurdity of humans building tools to save time only to waste it faster. He'd find irony in people meditating for calm only to post about it for approval. But he wouldn't condemn, he'd understand. For Marcus knew the frailty of the human condition. His wisdom would never be arrogance, it would be compassion, informed by experience. He'd forgive easily, not because he excuses weakness, but because he recognizes it in himself. When public life feels unbearable, he'd retreat, not to escape, but to recharge. Maybe he'd hike into mountains or sit by the sea. He'd look at the horizon and remind himself that no empire, no nation, no ideology lasts. Only nature endures. He'd breathe in the salt air, feel the vastness of existence, and remember how small his worries are. He'd say, "All this will pass, as it always has. Only virtue stands outside time." That thought alone would restore him. He'd advise us to stop waiting for peace to appear and start cultivating it. He keeps saying life is hard, he'd write, but you forget you were built for it. He'd know that ease weakens and challenge strengthens, that the soul grows only through friction. He'd say that modern people fear discomfort too much and truth too little. And he'd urge us to train the mind daily through patience, through restraint, through honesty, until composure becomes our nature. When asked what he thinks of religion, fame, politics, or modern morality, he'd likely respond, "I think of how people treat each other." For him, virtue was the only true faith, kindness the only law, and reason the only authority. He'd see how people chase ideologies while neglecting integrity, and he'd remind them that no belief system can save a man who refuses to govern himself. He'd say, "Your character is your God. Your actions are your prayers." In moments of solitude, he'd often sit and think about humanity, its endless striving, its blindness, its beauty. He'd feel sorrow for how we waste our potential, but never despair. Because Marcus believed in humanity's capacity to rise, not through innovation, but through introspection. He'd say, "There is nothing new in chaos, only new faces wearing it." And so he'd live quietly, hoping that one soul, maybe two, would see his example and awaken. In his final reflections, he'd write something like this: "The test of a man is not how loud he speaks truth.
The world does not need another emperor. It needs more souls that rule themselves." And after saying this, Marcus would quietly disappear into the rhythm of life, not to escape it, but to move with it, a silent force in a noisy age, a stillness that humbles chaos. He would teach through his being, not his words, because to him, philosophy was never meant to be preached, it was meant to be lived. And the people who crossed his path would sense something different, a presence unbothered by time, uncorrupted by trends, unshaken by opinion. They'd feel peace in his company, not because he gave them answers, but because he made them realize they already had them. His calm would be contagious, his discipline a quiet rebellion, and slowly, without speeches or fame, he'd become what he always was, a guide for those lost in the storm of their own making. He would still write in his journal, though now perhaps on a digital tablet instead of parchment, the glow of the screen reflecting the same reflections he once wrote under candlelight. He'd type words not for others to read, but for his own soul to understand. Reminders that virtue, humility, and gratitude remain undefeated by centuries. Do not waste life arguing what a good man should be. Be one.
He'd remind himself daily that everything around him, the news, the noise, the chaos, exists only as long as he gives it permission to rule his mind. His mornings would begin in silence, his nights would end in gratitude, and between those hours he'd move through the world like a man in full control of his inner weather. He'd watch people chase trends, crises, and causes, all burning out in their pursuit of being seen. And he'd sigh gently, "You seek to be remembered by others before you've remembered who you are." For Marcus, legacy was never about permanence, it was about presence. To live each day rightly was immortality enough. He'd say that the soul needs no monument because virtue is self-sustaining. It echoes in every act of goodness that outlives its source. And when people asked him how to live in such a divided, chaotic world, he'd simply reply, "Live well, even if no one notices, especially if no one notices. Because integrity does not need an audience, it only needs your attention." He'd find beauty in simplicity, in a walk without music, in a meal without hurry, in a conversation without pretense. He'd remind us that peace isn't something to find, it's something to stop losing. Every moment we run from stillness, every distraction we indulge, every emotion we obey blindly, we trade fragments of our peace for illusions. The price of wisdom, he'd say, is solitude with your own thoughts. And though he'd walk among millions who scroll endlessly to escape themselves, he'd remain grounded, anchored in the same truth that guided him 2 millennia ago, that the mind, when disciplined, can turn even chaos into clarity. And if he stood in front of the modern crowd, influencers, workers, dreamers, and doubters alike, he wouldn't condemn them. He'd understand them, because he knew that even in ancient Rome, men and women were lost in similar illusions: wealth, fame, pleasure, distraction. Only the forms have changed, the traps are eternal. He'd say, "You are not weak for being tempted. You are only weak when you stop resisting." And he'd teach them that strength is not the absence of struggle, but the mastery of it. Every temptation resisted, every emotion observed without obedience, every ego humbled, those are the quiet victories that build the invincible soul. He'd see that people chase external motivation, quotes, videos, voices, to light a fire they never tend themselves. He'd remind them, no one can make you disciplined. It must be grown from within. He'd teach that self-mastery is not about constant control, but consistent awareness, the ability to see your impulses before they become your identity. He'd say that the man who knows why he suffers can endure anything, but the one who suffers without purpose drowns in comfort. For Marcus, pain was never punishment, it was instruction. And he'd invite everyone to learn from their own discomfort, to turn suffering into sculpture, to carve strength from every setback. And when night fell once again, he'd step outside, breathe in the cool air of the 21st century, and gaze at the stars, the same stars he once looked upon from his Roman palace. He'd realize nothing has changed above, only below. Empires have risen and fallen, but the constellations remain unmoved. He'd smile softly and whisper to himself, "All that happens is familiar. All that will happen is bearable." And with that,
He'd close his eyes, unafraid of tomorrow, because he lived rightly today. That's how Marcus Aurelius would live in 2025, not as a philosopher trapped in time, but as a timeless guide walking among us. He wouldn't preach stoicism as a concept, but as a way of breathing, calm, deliberate, unshakable. He'd remind us that no matter how fast the world runs, the mind remains the only kingdom worth ruling. And in every soul that learns to govern itself, a new Rome would rise, not of stone or conquest, but of reason, virtue, and peace. And maybe then, in the quiet minds of a few who truly understand, Marcus would live again, not in memory, but in action, in presence, in the art of being unbroken.
For the world will never slow down for you. You must slow down within it. And as he'd continue walking, he'd see the cities glowing like constellations, every window holding a soul wrestling with their own existence. He'd realize that humanity hasn't changed because human nature is the same river flowing through new landscapes. Greed, love, fear, ambition, all reshaped but never erased. He'd know that the same soul that once longed for glory in the Colosseum now seeks validation online, and the same insecurity that once drove wars now fuels trends. But he'd not despair. He'd see hope in the simple truth that if vice survives through centuries, so does virtue. And virtue needs only one mind to begin the change. He'd remind us that we don't need to save the world, only ourselves, for the world is shaped by what each person becomes. He'd find modern spirituality fascinating yet fragile, people seeking transcendence through shortcuts, through retreats and substances, through endless self-analysis while avoiding self-discipline. He'd write, "You cannot find peace by chasing it. You must live rightly, and peace will follow." He'd observe how we meditate to calm the mind, but never to correct it, how we seek balance while refusing boundaries. And he'd warn, "You confuse comfort for clarity." He'd teach that true spirituality is not an escape from the world, but the art of being undisturbed within it. To meditate, for him, would not be to flee chaos, but to face it until chaos no longer rules you. He'd look at modern leadership, full of slogans, image management, and shallow empathy, and he'd shake his head softly. "You lead best when you serve least yourself," he'd say. He'd teach that leadership is not authority, but accountability, not status, but service. He'd remind us that the greatest ruler is one who masters his own impulses before commanding others. He'd see that modern power often corrupts because it feeds ego. And he'd remind us that only the humble can wield influence without being devoured by it. He'd say, "When your goal is to impress, you have already lost your purpose." And he'd live by example, leading not with orders, but with presence, teaching through calm rather than command. He'd also see how the world worships intellect, yet forgets wisdom. Universities overflow with information, but starve for understanding. Students can quote philosophers, but fail to live like one. He'd walk into a lecture hall and write on the board, "Knowledge is useless unless applied to living." He'd remind them that reading about virtue without practicing it is like studying fire without feeling its heat. He'd say that education should not produce workers, but thinkers, not consumers, but creators.
Learn, he'd say, not for a career, but for character. And he'd remind teachers that their duty is not to feed minds, but to awaken them. Marcus would also confront how humanity treats the earth, not as home, but as possession. He'd see oceans choked with plastic, forests burned for profit, and skies thick with greed. He'd sigh and write, "You cannot live in harmony with yourself if you are at war with nature." He'd teach that Stoicism was never human-centric, it was cosmic, that virtue means living in accord with the whole, not exploiting it. He'd say, if you destroy what sustains you, you destroy yourself. And though he'd never march with slogans, his quiet life of moderation and respect would speak louder than 1,000 protests. In politics, he'd remain unshaken by left or right because he'd see that division is the new empire's entertainment. He'd remind us that ideologies change, but human folly stays. He'd say, do not pledge loyalty to opinion, pledge it to reason. He'd teach that truth is not owned by groups, but discovered through humility. He'd remind us that anger disguised as justice remains anger. He'd write, the wise man acts, but he does not react. And he'd show that true unity is born not from agreement, but from shared virtue. He'd also see the epidemic of loneliness, millions connected by networks, but untouched by intimacy. He'd see people afraid to be vulnerable, hiding behind personas, filters, and humor. He'd whisper, you fear rejection because you have not yet accepted yourself. He'd teach that belonging begins with honesty, that love grows only in truth. He'd remind us that friendships built on convenience die in hardship, but those rooted in respect endure time. He'd say, be the kind of friend you wish to have, loyal, patient, present. And he'd remind us that every soul longs not for attention, but for understanding. At night, he'd sit by the window again, watching the city hum like a living organism. He'd write, men chase immortality through fame, but the soul achieves it through virtue. He'd remind himself that peace is not found in withdrawal, but in wise engagement. He'd think about how easily humans complicate what is simple, how truth has always been near but buried under noise. He'd write, you have all that the ancients sought, time, reason, and will. Use them. And he'd drift to sleep, content not because the world had improved, but because he had remained uncorrupted by it. And if the morning came again, Marcus would rise the same, calm, grounded, ready to meet the day as it is. He'd remind us that every sunrise is a question. Will you live by impulse or by principle today? He'd say that the measure of a man is not what he achieves, but what he withstands. He'd show us that in a world obsessed with doing more, the greatest act is being present. And his life would become the quiet revolution we all crave, proof that even in the chaos of 2025, serenity is still possible for those who choose it. He'd not promise an easy life, but a meaningful one. And if his words could echo through every restless mind, they'd say this: the modern world does not need another emperor. It needs more souls that rule themselves.
He would rise each morning, not as a ruler returning to his throne, but as a student returning to life's endless classroom. His eyes steady, his breath calm, his thoughts anchored in reason while the world spins in frenzy around him. He would see how modern humanity is haunted by the illusion of progress, how we build towers higher but our minds grow weaker, how we communicate faster but understand less, how we chase freedom yet remain shackled to desire. He would watch us scroll through lives that are not ours, measuring our worth through fleeting images, and whisper, "The more you chase what fades, the more you lose what stays." He would see how people fill their minds with headlines, gossip, and fear, and he'd remind us that the mind becomes what it consumes. To Marcus, wisdom would not be an aesthetic, but a discipline, a daily training of thought, a workout of the soul. He'd teach that mental strength isn't built in calm seas, but in storms, that clarity is born from struggle, and that courage is not about fighting others, but conquering the self. He would look at the modern obsession with constant activity, the glorification of hustle, the worship of speed, and quietly question, why are you racing if you don't know where you're going? To him, stillness would not mean doing nothing. It would mean doing the right thing without distraction. He'd say that time is not short, but wasted, that every moment spent chasing what doesn't matter is theft from what does. In his world, attention would be sacred, a tool to shape reality. And he'd remind us that you cannot master life if you cannot master where your attention goes. He'd walk through cities lit by 1,000 screens and see how each light represents a restless soul, seeking meaning in pixels, forgetting that meaning was always found in reflection. He'd tell us that you don't need more information, you need more intention. Marcus would look at our concept of success, the endless race for validation, and he'd smile softly because he'd seen it all before. He'd remind us that Caesar's crown and influencer fame are the same illusion in different packaging. Both promise immortality, both fade in silence. He'd teach that true power is not over others, but over one's own mind. And if someone insulted him online, he'd probably write, "If it's true, accept it. If it's false, ignore it." He wouldn't fight to defend his image, because he'd know that character is untouchable by rumor. He'd see how many people build their worth from external praise and say, "You are borrowing your peace from others, and every loan must be repaid in anxiety." He'd show us that freedom begins the moment you stop needing applause. He'd reflect on how we've turned self-improvement into performance, books, podcasts, quotes, yet forget to practice the very lessons we preach. He'd warn that reading about discipline isn't the same as living with it, that talking about peace isn't the same as being peaceful. For Marcus, wisdom was never about words, but actions, never about knowing the way, but walking it daily. He'd see that people often seek meaning only when life breaks them, and he'd say, "Then let life break you, but let it rebuild you wiser." Because to him, suffering was not an obstacle, but a forge, and only through fire does iron become a blade. He would walk through hospitals, seeing patients hooked to machines that keep them alive, but not truly living, and he'd remember his own mortality. He'd say, "Death smiles at us all. The only thing you can do is smile back."
But unlike the modern fear of death, his smile would be serene, not from apathy, but from acceptance. He'd remind us that life's brevity gives it meaning, that we ruin our days by pretending they're infinite. He'd teach that to meditate on death is not to be morbid, but to live fully awake. He'd see how people waste their precious hours in envy, anger, regret, and comparison, and whisper, "You are dying every moment. Make it count." In love, Marcus would not chase possession, but partnership. He'd see that modern relationships often crumble under expectation, that we seek others to complete us rather than to walk beside us. He'd say, "You cannot love if you are not whole." For him, love would not be a fire that consumes, but a light that guides. He'd value loyalty over passion, understanding over infatuation, peace over excitement. And he'd remind us that love without self-mastery becomes attachment, and attachment is the root of pain. When facing loss, he would not cry out in despair, but breathe in deeply and say, "It was given to me for a time. Now it returns to nature." He'd teach that grief is sacred because it proves that you dared to care, that even sorrow can be beautiful when accepted without resistance. He'd remind us that everything, joy, pain, success, failure, is borrowed from the universe and must one day be returned. That's why he'd never cling too tightly to anything, not even his own name. Because to Marcus, ownership was an illusion, stewardship was the truth. In moments of doubt, when the modern mind would spiral into anxiety and fear of the future, Marcus would practice the same meditation he did 2,000 years ago, to focus only on what he can control, his thoughts, his actions, his response. He'd teach that peace doesn't come from certainty, but from readiness. That life will never promise comfort, but it can promise meaning if you face it with virtue. He'd remind us that we cannot choose the world's chaos, but we can choose our composure. And that single choice, repeated daily, is the essence of Stoicism. By the time night fell, he'd sit under the quiet sky, the same stars he once looked at from Rome, and feel no difference. Empires rise and fall, technologies evolve, but the human heart remains the same, restless, yearning, afraid, hopeful. He'd write in his journal again, maybe on a digital tablet now instead of parchment, the same simple wisdom that outlived time. When you arise in the morning, think of what a privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to love, to act. He'd close his eyes knowing that peace isn't a place you reach, but a way you walk. And if he could speak to us one last time, he'd say, "Do not wait for the world to calm down. Become the calm."
How precious it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to love, to act, and that would be enough. He wouldn't measure his life in achievements or followers, but in moments of awareness, in how often he remained present when the world demanded distraction. If you watched him in 2025, you wouldn't see a man chasing greatness. You'd see someone quietly becoming unshakable while the rest of the world trembles. His calm would not be laziness, it would be mastery. His detachment wouldn't be coldness, it would be freedom. And his silence would not be emptiness. It would be depth, the kind that makes noise meaningless. He'd look around at how we've built a culture of comparison and competition, people sprinting without direction, exhausted by the pursuit of more. And he'd remind us that ambition without clarity is chaos. He'd say, "You cannot aim your life if you don't know your target." To him, purpose wouldn't be found in success, but in service. Not in what the world gives you, but in what you give to it. He'd likely walk through cities where people live surrounded by abundance, yet feel perpetually poor, scrolling through the highlights of strangers, and he'd whisper, "You have everything, yet live as if you have nothing." Because to Marcus, poverty was not a lack of things, but a lack of gratitude. He'd live simply, not because he rejects luxury, but because he knows how easily comfort enslaves. He'd own less, want less, and feel richer than anyone obsessed with status. His apartment might be small, but his inner world would be vast. He'd spend mornings in silence, evenings reflecting, and the spaces between with full attention. He wouldn't post quotes about mindfulness. He'd live them quietly. He wouldn't chase attention because he knew attention is the currency of the desperate. He'd move through life like a still lake, reflecting everything, disturbed by nothing. In work, Marcus would be disciplined but detached. He'd give his best to each task, not because he seeks recognition, but because excellence is its own reward. He'd remind us that doing things well is a form of respect for the world, for others, for oneself. And when things go wrong, when plans fail, when people disappoint, when circumstances twist beyond control, he'd simply say, "It was written so," not as resignation, but as alignment with nature. Because to him, fate is not an enemy, but a teacher. Every loss, every challenge, every delay would be his lesson in patience and strength. He would see how the modern world fears boredom, how we flee silence like it's pain, and he'd say, "You cannot meet yourself if you're always running away." He'd spend hours walking without headphones, eating without screens, thinking without noise. He'd remind us that the mind needs stillness the way lungs need air. And he'd notice how people numb themselves with endless consumption, not just of goods, but of experiences, content, attention. And he'd whisper, "The more you consume, the less you create." To him, fulfillment would come not from stimulation, but from contribution. He'd treat every stranger with quiet respect, not because it's fashionable, but because he'd see himself in them. Whether speaking to a janitor or a billionaire, his tone would not change, because he'd measure worth not by titles, but by virtue. He'd understand that we are all fragments of the same soul, all actors in the same play, and he'd remind us that kindness costs nothing, but buys everything that matters. He'd never argue online, because he'd know arguments rarely seek truth. They seek victory, and victory over others to him would be the lowest form of conquest. The highest would always be victory over the self. When chaos erupts, wars, injustice, corruption, despair, Marcus wouldn't retreat into apathy. He'd engage, but with clarity. He'd help where he can, accept where he can't, and stay grounded where most are swept away. He'd say, "The world doesn't need more opinions, it needs more examples." And so he'd lead quietly, by action, by integrity, by consistency. People would notice not his words, but his presence, calm in crisis, gentle in anger, unwavering in principle. He'd redefine strength. In a culture that confuses aggression with power, he'd show that gentleness is not weakness, but mastery. That patience is not passivity, but control. And that forgiveness is not surrender, but freedom. He'd remind us that the strongest people aren't those who dominate, but those who endure without bitterness. He'd embody a strength that doesn't need to shout, the kind that simply endures like mountains under storm. And in a world addicted to outrage, he'd stand as proof that calmness is rebellion. Marcus would look at how people define identity today, through tribes, politics, trends, labels, and he'd smile sadly, because he'd know that identity built on external things is fragile. He'd remind us that who you are is not your job, your body, or your following. It's the choices you make when no one's watching. He'd say, strip away the mask, and you'll find what you were always meant to be. To him, authenticity would not be about expression, but alignment, living so that your actions and your values are one. He'd teach that happiness is not pleasure, but peace, not found in having more, but in needing less. He'd say, you suffer because you think you're missing something, but you were never missing anything, only distracted. He'd show that joy comes not from controlling life, but from flowing with it. And he'd remind us that nothing truly good can be taken from you. Not integrity, not courage, not understanding. Everything else is temporary scenery on the stage of existence. And when faced with injustice, he wouldn't rage, he'd act. He'd do what he could, where he could, without theatrics or self-praise, because virtue to him was not about reputation, but responsibility. He'd remind us that goodness is not what you post, but what you persist in doing when no one applauds. And he'd know that even if the world forgets your deeds, nature does not, because every good act strengthens the whole. If you were to sit beside Marcus Aurelius in 2025, perhaps on a quiet park bench as traffic hums and people rush past, you'd see a man utterly at peace amid noise. His gaze steady, his breath slow, his attention undivided. He wouldn't tell you to escape the world, but to master your place within it. He'd say, you don't need to leave society to be free, you just need to leave its illusions. He'd remind you that everything you seek, clarity, strength, peace, already lives inside you, waiting for discipline to uncover it. And maybe before leaving, he'd smile and say, if you wish to live like me, don't worship my words, practice them. Because the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius was never meant to be admired, it was meant to be lived. And in a world that celebrates noise, vanity, and endless distraction, the greatest rebellion would be to live as he would, calm, rational, unshakable, free. To wake each day not seeking what the world can give, but what you can give to the world. To live without needing to prove anything to anyone. To die knowing you lived rightly, not loudly. That is how Marcus Aurelius would live in 2025, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of what humanity could still become. He would not condemn the modern world, he would illuminate it. He'd walk among us quietly, like a lantern in the fog, reminding us that wisdom has no era, virtue has no expiration, and the human soul, when disciplined, awake, and free, remains timeless.